The night was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. In a peaceful suburban neighborhood, most houses had already gone dark, their owners tucked safely in bed. But inside one small home, at the end of the street, Max, a loyal German shepherd, was wide awake. His ears twitched at the faintest noise. A rustling sound. A footstep, maybe? Max lifted his head from his cozy spot near the front door, his sharp eyes scanning the dark. Living room. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Then, thump. A noise came from outside, near the backyard fence. Max was on his feet in an instant, his muscles tensed. He let out a low, warning growl, his keen senses detecting something, or someone, lurking in the shadows. In the bedroom, his owner, Jake, stirred. A light sleeper, Jake had learned to trust Max's instincts. If the dog was on edge, something wasn't right. He sat up, listening carefully. And then he heard it too. A faint clink, like metal against metal. Jake's heart pounded. He grabbed his phone and tiptoed toward the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch. His breath hitched. A dark figure was crouched near the back gate, struggling with the lock. The man was dressed in black, a hood pulled over his head. A thief. Jake's pulse raced as he reached for the baseball bat he kept near his bed. But before he could make a move, Max was already ahead of him. The dog let out a fierce bark, the kind that sent chills down a person's spine. The burglar flinched but didn't run. Instead, he yanked the gate open and sprinted toward the house. Jake barely had time to react. The back door rattled as the man tried to force his way in. Panic surged through Jake's veins. Should he call the police? Should he confront the intruder? But Max had other plans. Before the thief could take another step, Max lunged. His powerful legs propelled him forward like a bullet, his teeth bared. The man barely had time to turn before Max tackled him to the ground with a force that sent them, both rolling across the yard. The thief screamed in shock, kicking wildly, but Max was relentless. His deep growls echoed through the night as he held the intruder down, his sharp teeth inches from the man's face. Jake rushed outside, his phone shaking in his hands as he dialed 911. His heart was racing, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the sight in front of him. His gentle, loyal companion had just taken down a full-grown man in seconds. The neighborhood lights flicked on, one by one. Doors creaked open. Curious eyes peeked from behind curtains. Something was happening, but no one, absolutely no one, was prepared for what came next. Jake's hands trembled as he gripped his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button. The 911 dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker. "911. What's your emergency?" Jake opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the thief let out a pained grunt. "Get this dog off me," the man hissed, trying to wriggle free. Max wasn't letting go. His teeth were bared, his deep growl rumbling like a storm. The thief's arm was pinned beneath him, and every time the man moved, Max pressed down harder. Jake took a shaky step forward, his mind racing. Should he pull Max back? What if the thief had a weapon? Just then, porch lights flicked on all around the street. Neighbors, still groggy from sleep, peeked out from their doors and windows. A few started stepping onto their porches, murmuring in confusion. "What's going on?" "Mrs. Peterson," the elderly woman from next door called out. Before Jake could answer, the thief made a desperate move. Using his free hand, he reached into his pocket, fast, too fast. Jake's stomach dropped. A knife? A gun? Max sensed the danger before Jake did. With a sudden, ferocious bark, he lunged again, sinking his teeth into the man's sleeve and yanking his arm away. Something small and metallic flew from the thief's hand, clattering onto the pavement. Jake's eyes darted to the object, a crowbar. The man had been armed. Jake's grip on the phone tightened. "There's a break-in at my house." My dog caught the thief. Send the police now." The thief groaned, realizing he was trapped. The more he struggled, the more Max growled. His breathing was ragged, his hoodie torn. A few neighbors were stepping closer now, their phones out, recording everything. The murmurs grew louder. "That's the guy who broke into my garage last week," someone shouted. "I saw him near my house 2 nights ago." Another voice added. Jake's heart pounded. This wasn't just some random thief. This guy had been targeting the neighborhood, and Max had caught him. But then, something changed. The thief, who had been struggling seconds ago, suddenly went still. His eyes weren't on Jake anymore. They were darting toward the street, scanning the houses. His lips pressed into a thin line. Something was off. Jake frowned. Why wasn't he panicking? Why wasn't he begging for mercy or trying to run? That's when Jake noticed it. A black car, parked at the end of the street. Its engine was running. Someone was inside, and whoever they were watching. A chill ran down Jake's spine. This wasn't just a thief. He had backup. Max must have sensed it too, because his ears twitched, and he let out another low growl, this time directed toward the car. The thief smirked. "You have no idea what you've just done," he muttered under his breath. Jake's blood ran cold. Before he could process what that meant, screech. The black car's tires screeched as it suddenly lurched forward, speeding down the street, heading straight for them. The neighbors gasped. Someone screamed. Jake's instinct screamed at him to move. But Max was already ahead of him. With a powerful leap, he yanked the thief off the ground, dragging him backward with surprising strength. The man yelped, but it saved them both. No. Car missed them by inches. Instead, it veered sharply to the side, barely avoiding a streetlight. For a second, Jake caught a glimpse of the driver, another man in a ski mask. And then, just as fast as it had come, the car sped off, disappearing into the night. Silence fell over the street. Jake's heart was hammering. The thief groaned, coughing, from where he had landed. But he wasn't laughing anymore. The police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Jake looked down at Max, who stood beside him, his chest rising and falling. His sharp eyes never leaving the spot where the car had vanished. This wasn't over, and whatever was going on, it was bigger than just one thief. The sound of sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the houses. A police cruiser screeched to a stop in front of Jake's house, followed by another. Officers poured out, hands on their holsters, eyes scanning the scene. Max was still standing guard over the thief, his growls steady and low, his body tense. One of the officers, a tall man with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "Hands where we can see them," he ordered. Jake immediately raised his hands. "It's him, not me. My dog caught him trying to break in." The officer's gaze shifted to the thief on the ground, then to Max, who still hadn't moved. "That true?" he asked the thief. The man, now breathing heavily, glared at Jake, but didn't answer. Jake pointed to the crowbar lying on the pavement. He had that. He was trying to get inside. The officer nodded to his partner, who quickly moved in. The thief barely resisted as they yanked him up and cuffed his wrists behind his back. As they patted him down, another officer examined the black car that had nearly run them over. But the vehicle was long gone, swallowed by the darkness. "We need a bolo on a black sedan, no plates," the officer radioed in. Driver might be connected to a string of break-ins. Jake's mind was still racing. Who was that driver? What was their connection to this guy? Just then, one of the officers found something in the thief's hoodie pocket. A folded-up paper. The officer opened it, his brows furrowing. Jake stepped closer. "What is it?" The officer studied it for a moment before handing it to him. "You tell me." Jake's stomach dropped the second he saw it. It was a map of his street. But not just any map. It had markings, red circles drawn around certain houses. One of those houses was his. Jake's throat went dry. This wasn't a random break-in. The thief smirked. "Told you," he muttered under his breath. "You have no idea what you've just walked into." Before Jake could press him for answers, another officer interrupted. "We found a burner. Phone on him." The officer turned the screen toward them. It had one unread message. "You got caught. We're done. Find your own way out." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Whoever sent that message, they were watching. Max let out a small whimper and nudged Jake's leg. It was as if he sensed that something was very wrong. The officer holding the phone cursed under his breath. "Looks like someone just cut him loose." Jake clenched his fists. "So that's it? He just takes the fall while his crew gets away?" "But..." The officer shook his head. "Not exactly." He glanced at the thief. "Because now we know they exist." The thief's smirk faltered. Another officer spoke up. "We've been tracking a group of burglars targeting this area for weeks. They hit houses with security gaps. No cameras, no alarms, quiet spots. But this..." He tapped the map in Jake's hands. "This is proof they were planning something bigger." Jake swallowed hard. "How much bigger?" The officer exhaled. "Big enough that your dog just saved a lot of people from waking up to an empty house." Jake looked down at Max, who was still alert, ears twitching. His loyal companion had sensed danger before anyone else. If Max hadn't been there... Jake didn't want to finish that thought. The thief, now sitting in the back of the squad car, finally broke his silence. He leaned forward slightly, eyes locked onto Jake. "You think this is over?" His voice was quiet, but his words sent a shiver through the air. "It's just getting started." Jake clenched his jaw. But before he could respond, Max suddenly whipped his head toward the dark street. His body tensed again, a deep growl vibrating through his chest. Jake followed his gaze. A shadow. A figure standing at the far end of the road, half hidden by a tree. Watching. And then, they disappeared. Jake's pulse pounded. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The street was quiet again, but Jake's heart was still racing. The figure had vanished into the darkness, but their presence left behind an uneasy feeling, like an unfinished sentence hanging in the air. Max, still tense, stood protectively in front of Jake. His ears perked, his nose sniffing the cold night breeze. Even as the thief was locked in the squad car, the danger didn't feel over. "Did you see that?" Jake whispered to the nearest officer, pointing toward the spot where the figure had stood. The officer frowned and shined his flashlight down the road, but there was nothing there. Just an empty street and the distant hum of the city. "Could have been one of his crew checking in," the officer muttered. "But they won't risk coming back now. We'll patrol the area for the rest of the night, just in case." Jake exhaled, trying to steady himself. The thought of someone else watching, waiting, sent chills through him. Another officer approached. "We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow to give a statement. But for now, I suggest locking your doors, keeping your lights on, and staying alert." Jake nodded, his mind still reeling. As the police car carrying the thief drove away, Max finally relaxed. His tail wagged slightly, and he let out a tired sigh, nudging Jake's leg. Jake crouched down and wrapped his arms around Max. "You really saved us tonight, buddy," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't even want to think about what would have happened if you weren't here." Max licked his face, his tail thumping against the pavement. Jake stood up, looking around at the quiet houses lining the street. Most of the neighbors had gone back inside, but a few still peeked through their curtains. The entire neighborhood had been shaken. Just then, An elderly man, Mr. Peterson, stepped out from his porch across the street. "Jake," he called, his voice rough with age. Jake turned. "Yeah?" "Your dog. He's a hero." Jake gave a small, tired smile. "Yeah, he really is." A few other neighbors murmured in agreement from their doorsteps. The news would spread by morning. How Max had taken down a thief. How he had stopped something much bigger from unfolding. Jake took one last look down the road where the shadow had stood, then shook his head. This wasn't over, but tonight, they had won. With one final pat on Max's head, Jake turned back toward the house. "Come on, buddy. Let's go inside." Max trotted beside him, his tail wagging, his eyes still sharp and alert. Because even though the night was ending, both of them knew this was only the beginning.